Hope everybody had a good lunch. There was a terrific morning session in every sense of the term. What Sarah and I had been discussing, I guess what's been billed on the agenda is is sort of art history meets, I don't know, history. It's like Alien versus Predator or something like that. But in fact, but Sarah and I have worked very harmoniously together on a number of ventures, and rather than the original sort of a loose idea of, I guess we would have a little gab fest, Sarah rightly made a suggestion. Why don't we present a case study, or case studies, how we are approaching particular subjects tied to the Civil War right now, and that could be the basis of our discussion. So it's a pretty simple format. So Sarah's going to speak first on first case study.
Thanks, Josh.
Sure.
So I never thought I was actually going to write about the painting that I'm going to talk about today. It came about as a result of my association with the Newberry Library in Chicago. We're working together as a team to mount an exhibition on the visual culture of the North, the northern home front during the Civil War, and the show centers around 10 paintings from the Terra Foundation, one of which was this Lilly Martin Spencer home of the red, white, and blue, which unfortunately for the art historian has no provenance. No one knows if or where it was ever exhibited during the artist's lifetime. Were it exhibited, there was no criticism. Nobody knows who bought it. It just popped up in a New York gallery several years ago, and it was bought by the Terra Foundation. So this was my assignment. And we've already talked a lot about art history and history. I think that I feel that my own art historical interests dovetail and often overlap with those of historians, and that includes methodology. But as an art historian, I have a lot invested in keeping the image in play, keeping the image in the center, letting the image ask the questions, you might say, and letting the image make the argument. And this does involve close looking, but it also involves looking at a lot of primary sources, in literature, in manuscript, and so on. And of course, as we've discussed before, any art, any image is a representation, not an unimpeachably truthful document. But I'm more interested, too, in getting below the surface of what might seem the obvious or the transparent meanings of an image. I like to, I think it's more fun and more meaningful in the end to tease out ambiguities, tensions, and contradictions, sort of get down below the surface layer of the picture, and also to try to build a kind of constellation of images that will illuminate the many meanings, the multivalent kinds of meanings that it's possible to sort of tease out of any particular image. So let's look at this painting. This is Lilly Martin Spencer's Home of the Red, White, and Blue, and I'm glad that we've already seen Lilly Martin Spencer in the gallery. This painting dates from a year or two after she did The War Spirit at Home. It's about 24 by 30 inches, so it's basically an easel painting. And as you can see, there's an awful lot going on in it. So the first thing I would do, of course, would be to sort of map out the figures, the composition, the relationships, and we won't spend too much time doing that now because there's a lot of other material to go through, but clearly, here we have women in the center. A mother, again, it's a self-portrait, and her younger daughter, her older daughter. They're all dressed in hues that evoke the colors of the American flag, the Union flag, red, white, and blue. And then there's this very sort of perplexing entry of an organ grinder with a begging monkey. The girl is afraid of the monkey. She has a coin, but she's afraid to actually put it in the monkey's little cap. The little boy is handing a glass of milk up to the organ grinder. The grinder has a little girl with him who plays the tambourine. Over here, well, this is a grandmotherly figure, grandfather figure, and the wounded veteran home from the war. On the other side is what is clearly an Irish maid, a nursemaid, holding a baby, and the baby is wearing little sort of ribbons of red, white, and blue, and sort of reaching out to the center group. So you can sort of see right away that there's a division in the picture between the others, except for the baby. And this sort of united, reconnected American family, Anglo-American, or maybe Franco-American because Spencer's parents actually were French. But in any case, it seems like you're an opposition, sort of a tension between the two sides of the canvas, between the immigrant side and the established Anglo-American side, the sort of connected family that's been here for generations. But what interested me particularly about this painting were some of the details. And here again we get to the importance of close looking, and in particular the importance of looking at the actual painting, which I finally got to see, which kind of changed my argument when I began to see certain details. So what we see here are things that are very significant. As you can see, every one of the adult women has a gold thimble on her finger. This is the teenage daughter, this is the mother, the grandmotherly figure who's working on some bunting also has a thimble on this finger. And then there's this American flag, which is the most prominent thing in the foreground. It's not a whole flag, it's in two pieces. The stripes have been separated from, almost surgically cut from the Union, the stars, which are lying on a purple velvet footstool, almost like a little throne. And then, there's the sewing basket on top of the flag. And so you begin to make these connections. There's red, white, and blue thread, there's a pincushion. And so, at one level, it seems as if, well, this is what the painting is all about. Thimbles, sewing basket, flag in two pieces. The women are going to stitch up the wounds of war. They're going to heal the nation. They're going to stitch the nation back together. And so it would seem that women are given a very important role in the changing post-war landscape. But I decided, well, it's a little too transparent. There are so many other things going on in this painting. And I came across this essay by Harriet Beecher Stowe in the Atlantic Monthly after the war. And she exhorted women to take an active role in the reconstruction of the Union after the war. She said that women are the real architects of society, and that women could put noble meaning even into the humblest domestic tasks, including, and perhaps above all, sewing. So we could sort of look at this painting as somehow conveying the same kind of meaning about women's role in the post-war world, like putting meaning into these humble tasks of sewing, the sewing basket and the thimble being used to sort of stitch the nation back together. So the sense is that women have the skill, they have the will to mend a fractured Union, and all this seems really self-evident. But then I began to consider the fact that this was a post-war landscape of change. It's 1867. You know, it's even Reconstruction hasn't been sorted out yet. And so I began to think about how else could you know, where else can we go with this painting? It's obviously not just a genre painting, but kind of an allegory. And it's both prospective, that is, oriented toward the future, and at the same time retrospective. And this is where I began to ask questions about, well, the flag seems awfully important, and the fact that the women are here with the thimbles and the sewing basket. And so the first question that occurred to me was, well, what was the association of women and flags during the war? You know, why is this so important? You know, this juxtaposition. So I began to look into the Civil War visual culture from which Spencer, it turns out, actually drew her symbolic vocabulary. And there's a fair amount of writing about what happened early in the war, which was this outburst of flag mania. And for Spencer, the flag in the painting is actually based on a set of well-established conventions that were rooted in gendered cultural and social practices of the war. This particularly had to do with the connection of women and flags in many different levels. Women immediately began to make flags. They made them for display. They made them as big as the original Star-Spangled Banner. They made little flaglets. They made flag needle cases. There were flag fashions. There was the Union bonnet. But most particularly, women actually fabricated flags. They would give flags and also regimental colors to troops that were leaving home, going down to the battlefront. And this detail from a Thomas Nast spread in Harper's Weekly actually shows women, you know, together as if they were at a quilting bee, sewing a flag cooperatively. This, the little girls in the print here wave flags. They have red, white, and blue ribbons on their clothing. And this is Ladies Loyal Union League certificate. These were issued and signed by women who wanted to sort of testify to their loyalty. Woman pointing at the flag, exhorting her soldier husband to defend it. A woman holding up a flag to teach her children patriotism. Women watching soldiers parade by with flags waving above. And it seemed as if the connections between women and flags and patriotism and flag making were really, really very significant, and really in particular relevant to the way women wanted to play an active role in the war and to display their patriotic fervor. So it kind of made more sense in the Spencer painting that the flag and the thimbles and the sewing basket were such a significant cluster of images. But then I began to think about what else women must have been sewing during the war. It wasn't just flags, but rather women by the thousand, middle-class women, more especially working-class women, used needles and thimbles for much more practical purposes, making clothes, making equipment for the Union Army. And so this led me to Winslow Homer. Mere weeks after the firing on Fort Sumter and the beginning of real hostilities, Homer is placed, his illustration is placed on the cover of Harper's Weekly magazine, women making havelocks for the volunteers. And this is a parlor scene in which women are making these sunscreens for men's necks to attach to their kepis, because supposedly they would be going down south, and their necks would be burned by the hot southern sun. And there was this, just as there was flag mania, so also there was Havelock mania early in the war. And so this is what we see in Homer's painting. Women in a domestic context who at the same time are sewing articles of apparel that are meant for the soldiers, for the troops who are going off to war. But there are a couple of things about this illustration that I thought were particularly interesting. And again, Homer always repays close reading. There's a portrait of a soldier with his kepi hat on, looking down at the women and a billowing American flag. But this figure is interesting. This young woman actually has a soldier's cap on her head. And the woman next to her is actually working on a jacket, and you can just make out 3 letters, Z-O-U, on the jacket. And this is a reference to the Zouave regiments. And from these letters, we can sort of jump to the fashion for the Zouave jacket, the militarization of fashion early in the war, as we see in the Scoties illustration. But while Zouave jackets became fashionable, the soldier's hat, the kepi, never did. This wasn't something that women wore. They wore bonnets. So it's interesting that she has a kepi on her head. And it's interesting that in another Lilly Martin Spencer painting, The Artist and Her Family on the 4th of July Picnic, this young woman, who's in a kind of, sort of cheeky pose, has snatched the kepi from the head of the soldier whom she's standing next to, probably her boyfriend. So another question that came to me in thinking about this was, well, are these subversive? We talked about Lilly Martin Spencer's subversive little, sort of pot-pounding girl in the war spirit at home. And it would seem that, yes, maybe these gestures speak to the war's liberating potential for women. And women certainly did move into active public roles during the war, sort of nursing, fundraising, and moving into jobs that had formerly been held by men. So what this speaks to, well, basically, is this notion of home front and battle front. To what degree did the boundaries of domesticity dissolve during the course of the war as women took these more active public roles? And what can we tease out of images like these that would suggest both how those boundaries dissolved, because here we have the militarization of fashion, we have the making of war articles at home in domestic space. They would be making sort of fancy bonnets or other kinds of feminine apparel perhaps before the war. Here they're making soldiers' hats. By the way, Havelock mania quickly ran its course. And one soldier wrote back that the luckiest among his friends in the regiment were those who had the fewest mothers, sisters, and girlfriends, to make them Havelocks. But in any case, so to what degree, though, are they really liberated from the domestic sphere? They're still in the parlor, they're still contained, and there seems to be a kind of tension between women's active agency in their participation in the war and the fact that they're still sort of bound in this domestic setting, which we can see in another detail from Winslow Homer illustration of women in the war, in which we have these thoroughly domestic sewing circles that are occupied together, even with a sewing machine, making soldier shirts. And this is actually inscribed on the box so that you can make no mistake about the fact that they are sort of participating in the war effort, but in a ladylike and still pretty clearly circumscribed way. But many thousands of women also sewed shirts. They also sewed uniforms. But these were working class women. So the next thing I tried to find out about and think about was other forms of production, other forms of sort of domestic industry which was militarized during the Civil War. Thousands of women workers were doing outsourced or factory sort of sweated labor. The government contracted out much of the manufacture of uniforms, and unscrupulous contractors would hire women who labored long hours and who were certainly not well paid for their labor. And this actually represented an opportunity for many women who were working in these sort of miserable, underpaid conditions. They began to organize. Middle-class people helped them, but in New York, for example, Judge Daley and his wife helped to organize the Working Women's Protection Union. There were strikes, there were petitions. Women got all the way to the Secretary of War to demand, that they be given better wages and better working conditions. So here, the boundaries really did erode to some degree, even though union activism wasn't particularly effective. At least it sort of represented a change for women. There's a poem I found which praised women who were fighting in their own way, singing the song of the shirt, for a dagger, a needle, for a scissors for brand. So there's this sense of sort of womanly weapons being deployed in the war. And I found this sheet music cover was one that was used by Alice Voss in her book on the imagined Civil War. The song is by the Chicago composer Henry Work, and as you can see, it's a really surprising image, because here we have womanly weapons, different kinds of womanly weapons, which are used in a very, very warlike context. The song is about women getting sick of the fact that the men keep losing the battles, and they're going to go down themselves and sort of beat those rebels. So we have this fantasy scene. They're holding brooms, they're holding tea kettles, they're holding tongs, and they're chasing away these fleeing Confederates, women victorious in battle, using their domestic weapons in this completely different and surprising new context. And this actually did happen in real life in a certain sense. So, for example, when the Conscription Act was put into effect, women in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, actually marched on the courthouse to protest the draft, and they came, sort of brandishing kitchen knives and other implements. So, there's this kind of continuum of instances in which, the domestic apparatus of womanly, sort of work is, in a sense, weaponized. But then, so domestic labor is militarized to a much further degree in the federal arsenals, where bullets were made. And women were employed in great numbers in all of these arsenals. Once again, we have the example of Winslow Homer. I'm showing you a detail from his Harper's cover, which was actually published very soon after making havelocks for volunteers. So we have the domestic women making havelocks in their parlor, and we have the working class women who are doing tasks that actually look quite domestic. They're sitting quietly at a table. They could be at a quilting bee. And Lucretia Giesberg actually makes this comparison in her discussion of this image. Yes, they are under surveillance, but they're doing this very quiet, domestic-looking work. They look very demure, very proper, but what are they doing? They're stuffing bullets into gunpowder-loaded cartridges. The register at the bottom actually shows the men who are filling the cartridges. And so you think about this further. Well, this is another way that the home front and the battlefront somehow merged. You know, the boundaries between home and battlefield sort of dissolving and collapsing together. Because what are these women doing? They're making these little death packages, you know, things that could maim, things that could kill. And this brings us in mind of, you know, safety and the home front. Alice Foss writes about women's wounds as being emotional, wounds of the heart. But being on the home front was no guarantee of safety, as it turns out. So, you know, sort of reading about these arsenals led me eventually to one of the worst domestic home front disasters of the war, which was the explosion of the Allegheny Arsenal outside of Pittsburgh. 70 plus women and girls died in this explosion. You know, there was gunpowder all over the place. It didn't take much to, you know, sort of set off a charge. And so this is like a huge, huge explosion with the most gruesome carnage. The newspapers are full of grisly descriptions of sort of bodies being, you know, sort of severed into two pieces, limbs and piles of intestines lying about, nothing being left of some women but the singed bands, the steel bands of their hoop skirts. And it struck me that no battlefield could have been more horrible than this. Other explosions included Browns Island Confederate Laboratory in Richmond, 50 killed women, and the Washington Arsenal, in which more than 20 died. So there's a sense that, you know, the home front really is the battlefront. The two merge together. But we need to get back to Spencer at this point.
Isn't the date of that explosion kind of important as well?
Well, yeah, that's the same day as Antietam. I was going to actually bring that up, but you beat me to it. And the interesting thing is that, you know, Antietam completely overshadowed this explosion. It was much reported in the local papers. I searched high and low. There are no representations of it. There are no photographs. And, you know, it seems as if the means of visual representation simply couldn't cope with, you know, this damage to the female body at that time. But back to the flag. So this makes us think more about the flag. Why is it lying there? Whose body was the next question that I asked, because this is a flag that's sprawled in disorder, and it's in pieces. Why is it lying on the ground? You can't help, or I couldn't help anyway, thinking about the manner in which it seemed to evoke the wounded body. Amputated limbs. And so far from being simply two pieces of cloth that women are going to stitch together, it seemed much more complicated than that. And I found out that the flag during the war was intimately and, you know, very, very closely identified with the female body. You know, soldiers were, you know, sort of cultured, many soldiers at least, were, you know, sort of went to war with the idea that they were protecting their wives, they were protecting their mothers, and that the flag, which women had made for them to carry into battle, was a surrogate for the women on the home front, whom they were going to protect and cherish. And soldiers were willing to die for these flags. You know, the regimental colors, the Union flag. At Chickamauga, for example, you know, 1 and then 2 and then 3 of the regiment fell in protecting the flag. They didn't want it to hit the ground. They didn't want it to be trampled. They didn't want it to be despoiled by the Southerners and defiled on the ground by the rebels. And so these flags were given reverential treatment. You see, you know, there's probably dozens, if not scores, of images like these, you know, waving a tattered flag, you know, sort of keeping it off the ground on the battlefield. There are, you know, songs about the tattered battle flag. And in this painting by Thomas Waterman Wood, this is the return of an Irish regiment to New York with the flags that they bore and saved in battle. You know, they're in tatters, but even so, they're given this reverential treatment. And these were actually taken to the state capitol in Albany, where they were, you know, kind of enshrined lovingly as relics. But these are different from the flag in Spencer's painting, which is, these are triumphant. You know, they're sort of hanging proudly still from their staffs, even though they're in rags, whereas in Spencer's painting, this flag is heaped and jumbled on the ground. It's not tattered, and yet it looks wounded, and it's sprawling on the ground, make it seem almost like a feminized casualty of war. And to me, anyway, you know, it suggested, you know, sort of comparisons with the battlefield, you know, or with the wounded women of the explosion in the Allegheny Arsenal. Young women violently torn apart, men violently dead on the battlefield. Oh yeah, this is a typical quote, you know, Everett Hales' famous Man Without a Country, which was published in the Atlantic Monthly. This sort of sums it all up. Never let a night pass but you pray to God to bless that flag. Remember, boy, that behind all else there is the country herself, your country. Stand by her, boy, as you would stand by your mother. So there's this conflation of the sort of flag, the female body, and the, you know, sort of idea of the country itself as female. Which led, how much time do I have? Am I running on too late?
A little
Okay. Well, okay, so, you know, to sort of pick up the pace a little bit, then we have this veteran, Union veteran, who's returned to his family, and yet he's in the shade. He's wounded, he's got crutches, his boot is just touching the tip of the flag. So, you know, that sort of led into thinking about the status of the veteran, who's sort of readjusting, the traumatized veteran who might be an amputee, and the suggestion of the balance of power, you know, something that hangs in the balance. In something like Homer's Our Watering Places, the empty sleeve near Newport, in which the woman clearly has agency. So you get the sense again that, wow, the boundaries have eroded. She's driving the buggy or the phaeton while he sits there with his sleeve pinned up, sort of weak-looking, helpless, a victim. And yet, there's another story to the sort of history of amputees after the war. Many refused prosthetic devices. They were proud of their missing limbs because those had actually been sacrificed to save the Union. There was the Left Armed Corps, which was a whole group of soldiers who learned to write again with their remaining hands. And they had big exhibitions in New York and Washington. So there's an ambiguity here as to the status of this veteran. Is the missing limb an honorable scar or a symbol of weakness and dependency? And, you know, this song, The Empty Sleeve, you know, talks about the dear old flag, and, you know, and tells who saved our banner. So the wounded amputee is not necessarily someone who is less a man.
What's the date on that song?
It's like 1865, 66, I think. It's sort of right at the end of the war or post-war. Anyway, well, just to, you know, sort of try to speed through things here, then that get me to the organ grinders. Organ grinders were immigrants. Everyone found them annoying. They were recruited in the Padrone, you know, the Padrone system, labor brokers who brought them over to the United States. They would play on street corners with children who may or may not have been their own. It was all kind of business. So we have this alien figure who's seems to be intruding on the white Anglo-Saxon family group, you know, sort of begging What I discovered though was that there could be, obviously there's something about social change here, immigrant society, a threat to, the demographic balance of the United States, but at the same time, there actually could be kind of a subtle link between the organ grinder and the wounded veteran, because wounded veterans were everywhere, many of them begged, and some of them also played the organ, ground the organ on the corners of city streets. Real organ grinders, in fact, began to disappear around this time. But soldiers took their place and became wanderers, begging for coppers in this, what was called a disgraceful vagabondage. So what I find interesting about this is the place of men in the scheme of things. They're on the sidelines, they're aliens, they're begging, they are on crutches, and women are in the center. And I'm going to, and this gets us back to Spencer's painting finally. I'm not going to talk about the little son in yellow, because I don't have time. There's a whole other story about him. But if no war had been as much a women's war as this one, in the words of the diarist George Augustus Sala, would it be a woman's piece? And I think this is the question that the painting finally poses. Women are in the center, they're going to stitch up the wounds of war, they're going to heal the nation, and yet at the same time, after the war, there was increasing pressure on women to return to the same conventional domestic roles that they had temporarily left when the war started. So what about women? Where do they stand? And even though men are pushed to the sidelines in Spencer's painting, and women seem to lead the way, there's kind of a balance here between hope for the future. Elizabeth Cady Stanton talking about women going from slavery to freedom, the hope that women would win the vote, and the hope that was demolished when finally the 15th Amendment was ratified, giving the vote only to adult men. So there's a kind of general retrenchment that happens at the same time. So what would women be after the war? The women's movement kind of fell apart until the 1880s. This is a suffrage association meeting in Chicago. These are the male view. This is what women should be, again, after the war, as in Johnson's painting, Thomas Nass, Women's Kingdom. She's also in a rocking chair, but she's bossing the man around. This was, in a sense, what the retrenchment was all about. So I see this painting finally as one in which the question hangs in the air. Could the feminine needle and thread and thimble repair the damage done by war? Is the flag beyond repair? Women might stitch up the flag, but perhaps the wounds of war and the aftermath could be beyond their power to heal. But I still see this painting as unique in that the veteran is in the shade. Women hold pride of patriotic place, and for one moment in 1867, they seem to stand empowered, between the detritus of war and the threshold of a very uncertain future. And I'm sorry that took so long, and we should probably be discussing instead of me just talking, but maybe we'll have time for that.
Sure.